Hello, I'm Bohdan Nahaylo, Chief Editor of the Kyiv Post. I'd like to share with you some reflections on what's been going on in the last week or two, and this is my regular slot called Thinking Out Loud. Well, there's no need to tell you that there's plenty going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'll just mention some of the main things. But first, let's recall that this last week saw the 600th, and I'll repeat that, 600th day of Russia's barbaric all-out war against Ukraine. Today, as we record this, Russia has again struck at Ukrainian cities, its population, its infrastructure, bringing death and injuries and destruction. But Ukraine has continued to fight on and will continue to fight on, to carry the fight to the invaders. And it has struck at military bases and thwarted efforts to recapture territory regained in Ukraine's counteroffensive. So moving on to the international scene. There are the shocking developments in the Middle East after the horrendous attack on Israel by Hamas and Tel Aviv's very strong response. In Washington, drama over the election of a new speaker in the House of Representatives continues. And we're all watching this because of what it could mean not only for the US and international affairs generally, but particularly for Ukraine and the supply of aid to Ukraine from the United States. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the leaders of China and Russia have been making common cause again against the West, and this time with Hungary's opportunistic prime minister breaking ranks with his partners in the EU and NATO and joining them. And last but not least, the political shift in Polish politics, away from the conservative right, and a change of government now awaited after last Sunday's parliamentary elections, a result that has been welcomed in the EU and by many in Ukraine. So let's look at some of the broader implications that these developments have for Ukraine, their significance. Let's start with Hamas and Israel. Here we see, apart from the horror of what's been happening, the involvement, hidden or fairly obvious to many, of Iran and Russia. Many believe, probably rightly so, that this is a diversion away from Russia's war against Ukraine, and worry that it will take attention away from Ukraine's heroic struggle against Russia and the suffering that Russia has brought to Ukraine, and that it will also impact on the costs, on the level of support given to Ukraine. Further down the road, there are worries that if indeed Israel does insist on Palestinians leaving the Gaza Strip, that there will be a massive inflow of refugees into Europe, and that once again this will impact on the West's attitude, stance, support for Ukraine. There is the risk of this war, it's not a conflict in Israel, between Hamas, not necessarily the Palestinian people, developing into a broader conflict, drawing in more actors from the Middle East, from Arab countries, and perhaps even from beyond that. What will be the level of support that will be left for Ukraine? Indeed, how will Israel respond to Ukraine's massive outpouring of support for Israel at this, its very darkest moment in recent history? Ukraine has very strongly supported Israel, but we recall that the Israeli government hasn't necessarily been as forthcoming in its support for Ukraine and its deadly confrontation with Russia. Moving on, we see that President Biden is in Israel, the German Chancellor are there. So clearly what is happening in Israel has enormous international ramifications. And in China, in Beijing, where the Russian leader is meeting with his Chinese counterpart, there's probably jubilation that what is happening in Israel has upset the international scene and taken away attention from Ukraine. Indeed, Russia and China are more or less openly supporting Hamas and under the guise that they want a ceasefire, that they want understanding for the Palestinian people. But de facto, they are supporting this barbaric incursion by Hamas and the way that it massacred innocent civilian citizens. They are using this as a means to get at the West even more forcefully. This Western line, of course, is not surprising. But what is surprising, and of course I should mention that Iran is deeply implicated here, and so this axis that's being formed between China, Russia, and Iran now seems to have a Western participant, or a fellow traveler, shall we say. The Prime Minister of Hungary is there with them, Mr. Orbán, whose country is a member of NATO and a member of the EU. He seems to be wanting to play it both ways, to get the benefits of his integration into the Western world with whatever he can get, groveling as he is before the Chinese and Russian leaders. Orbán will not be pleased, of course, with the results of the election in Poland, because the election in Poland, where the liberal forces led by Donald Tusk, his civic platform, in coalition with their partners, will end, it seems, the more conservative rule of the PIS, which has held sway in the last years. This victory for the more liberal and more pro-EU coalition is obviously good news for Brussels. It's good news for many in Ukraine. But here we should say that we shouldn't just jump to conclusions and say, thank God there is a new government in Poland. We have to remember that under the PIS, despite the problems of the last few weeks over the grain issue, the PIS government has been very supportive of Ukraine, and President Duda, who is allied with them, aligned with this thing, has been a very, very strong supporter of Ukraine. So we acknowledge that and in no way belittle the support that has been shown by the government still there until the changes are made in supporting Ukraine as Ukraine's strongest partner in Eastern Europe. What else is there to say? Well, let's talk about some of the good things that have happened. Donald Trump's, let's call him protege, let's call him ally in the House of Representatives, Jim Jordan, has failed to be nominated. Several, or rather many of his Republican colleagues did not want him to get through. We know he is very strongly against further support for Ukraine. The situation remains dramatic, but we are watching it very closely. At least there is the indication that there are sufficient numbers of Republicans who do not want the House and American policy to go the way that Donald Trump would like it to go, at the cost of support for Ukraine. Biden, as I've said, President Biden is in Israel, but he has been stressing in recent days the continuing strong support of the US, of Washington's support for Ukraine. And we've seen that in action this week, because the long-range missiles that Ukraine was so desperate to get, the ATACMS, have actually been used this week with very powerful and successful results, destroying Russian helicopters and a military airbase in a place in occupied southern Ukraine that would have been off limits beforehand to Ukrainian artillery and rockets. The European Union has also promised Ukraine a generous amount of money to help Ukraine overcome any energy difficulties, given that further Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure over the winter period are to be expected. And as I say, the fact that in Poland there has been this major political shift, this has stopped the trend that we have seen in Slovakia recently and which exists in Hungary for a rightist, a rather anti-EU and pro-Russian line to take the course. Not that that was ever the danger in Poland. Apart from the fighting on the front and repairing damage, Ukraine has not been passive in its struggle to keep corruption in check and to meet the standards set by the EU for Ukraine's eventual accession. And this week we've seen further developments whereby the Ukrainian parliament has moved ahead to meet these requirements in the sphere of combating corruption. That's one thing. The fight against oligarchs continues, and several of the key tycoons now in custody or being sought by the authorities are having to answer for their particular record, as dubious as they were. Now, the other thing that is important is that the crackdown on corruption isn't just aimed at oligarchs. There is a concerted effort to try and break up schemes that are profiting from the war. This is inevitable in all war situations, in all countries, and we are gratified to see that the government and the presidential office is not passive in this respect. So we look ahead to the winter period, buoyed by the fact that despite all the difficulties, despite all the hardships and complications, strong support for Ukraine remains, and Ukraine, 600 plus days into its heroic battle in the name not only of Ukraine, but of the free world, of the democratic world, that it continues, and we look forward to victory in the coming year ahead. Thank you. This has been Bohdan Nahaylo, and I've been thinking out loud.